Hello, my name is Joseph Wise. Today I'll be discussing constitutional scrutiny tests, many First Amendment cases that involves freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and freedom of assembly. These Supreme Court decisions have helped define how constitutional rights are protected and how courts, you know, balance individual freedoms and uh, government authority. So this presentation begins with scrutiny tests and selective incorporation. Uh, I will then discuss several important Supreme Court cases that involves religious liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and the freedom of assembly. So courts use scrutiny tests when deciding whether a law violates constitutional rights. The reason for these tests is to basically determine whether the government's interest is strong enough to justify limiting a person's constitutional rights. The level of scrutiny also depends on what right is involved and who's affected by the law. So, before the courts decide which scrutiny tests apply, they ask two questions. First, is a fundamental right involved, like freedom of speech or freedom of religion? And second, does the law affect a suspect classification? Examples of suspect classifications are like race or national origin. Uh, the answers to those questions will help determine which level of scrutiny test the courts will apply. There's three levels of scrutiny. There's rational basis, which is the lowest level, and the it requires the government to have a legitimate reason for the law. There's immediate scrutiny, which requires an important government interest. And then there's strict scrutiny, which is the highest level and requires compelling government interest uh, using least restrictive means available. Laws reviewed under strict scrutiny are the most difficult for the government to defend. The First Amendment protects freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly. Um, so originally, these protections only applied to the federal government. Through a process known as selective incorporation, the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to apply uh, many of these protections to state governments as well. Uh, so this ensured that constitutional rights would be protected throughout the country. First Amendment also protects religious freedoms through two clauses. The Establishment Clause, which prevents government from establishing a religion, uh, and then the Free Exercise Clause, which protects an individual's right to practice their religion. These two clauses work together to balance religious freedom with government neutrality. In Sherbert versus Werner, a Seventh-day Adventist was denied unemployment because she refused to go to work on Saturdays, which was her Sabbath. The Supreme Court ruled in her favor and held that government must have a compelling reason before burdening religious practices. In Lemon versus Kurtzman, that involved state financial aid to religious schools. The Supreme Court ruled the programs unconstitutional, which created the Lemon Test. The test asks whether a law has a secular purpose, whether its primary effect advances or inhibits religion, and whether it creates excessive government entanglement with religion. In Oregon versus Smith, two members of the Native American church were denied unemployment benefits because they used peyote during a religious ceremony. The court ruled that natural laws that apply to everyone can be enforced even when they affect religious practices. Freedom of speech is one of the most important protections found in the First Amendment. It allows citizens to express ideas, criticize government, participate in public debate. The Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized that free speech is essential to a democratic society. In Gitlow versus New York, the state considered whether First Amendment protections applied to state governments. Gitlow's conviction was upheld, and the court ruled that free speech is protected from state interference through the 14th Amendment. In Bradenburg versus Ohio, the Supreme Court held that speech is protected unless it's intended and likely to produce imminent lawless action. So this became one of the strongest protections for free speech in American constitutional law. In New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court established the actual malice standard for defamation lawsuits involving public officials. So public officials must prove that false statements were made knowingly or recklessly in the disregard for truth. So the First Amendment also protects the right of people to peacefully assemble. However, governments may impose or regulate when, where, and how demonstrations occur. And as long as they are content neutral and it's applied equally. So in conclusion, the First Amendment protects some of the most important freedoms that Americans have. Through selective incorporation, these protections were extended to the states. The cases that I discussed today, I think, show how courts balance individual rights with government interests while still protecting freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly. I think understanding these cases helps us better appreciate the constitutional freedoms that shape everyday life in the United States. Thank you for listening.